it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Google Keynote lecture. And tonight our speaker is going to be Yann LeCun, who is the director of the AI research group at Facebook, which I realize is a bit ironic that we named that the Google lecture, but I'm sure Google won't mind. Okay, so I think most of you actually know already Yann LeCun, but I'm going to take 2 or 3 minutes of your time just to tell you the story of his first few years in AI, because you'll see it's really an inspiring story. Yann's career started in 1985 when he published a paper when he was a grad student in the proceedings of an obscure French conference that's now defunct. And that paper described an algorithm for training the synaptic weight in a multi-layer network. So as you can imagine, in training, I'm sorry, I missed the key point, train the synaptic weight of the hidden units in a multi-layer network. And as you can imagine, in the mid-'80s, that paper got a lot of attention, particularly because nobody knew how to do this. And he got, despite the fact that the paper was published in French and was never translated, he got about 466 citations. So far, so good. That's a good start for a career, except that the next year, Dave Rumelhart and Jeff Hinton published a paper in Nature that described what we call today the backpropagation algorithm, which was very much related to what Yann had published the year before. So he got scooped. But he got scooped by 57,000 citations. That's the number of citations that the Rumelhart paper has received since. So he got scooped of what is considered today as possibly the main contribution to AI of the last 30 years. That's a pretty rough start when you're grad students. But he moved on and joined Jeff Hinton's lab for postdocs and then became a researcher at AT&T, where he developed a new architecture, neural network architecture, which he called convolutional neural networks, a term that you're all familiar with because they're all over the place today. And he used this technology to start working on handwritten digit recognition. And I can tell you, I was at NIPS during those years, that approach took the field by storm. The meeting for years was all about how to train neural networks, how to improve things, and the best work was coming year after year from Yann's group at AT&T. And in the mid-'90s, there was a transition. Suddenly, everybody stopped, almost overnight, to work on neural networks and worked instead on graphical model and SVM. There was nothing more embarrassing to a machine learning person than to get caught training a neural network during that time. But Yann carried on along with a few people in the field. And I remember distinctly visiting his lab that was early 2000. And he showed me he had a little webcam hooked up to his computer. And he showed me how his latest network could recognize objects in natural scenes, which was the ultimate goal of this approach. And it was working really well. You know, he was doing a demo that never worked. It actually worked that day. I remember that. I was really impressed. And I asked, why is everybody ignoring this? And he immediately said, look, there are 2 problems. Training is really slow, and we don't have enough data. And as you know, in the mid-2000s, those problems got solved. People realized you could use a GPU to train the neural nets and drastically speed up the training of those networks, and huge databases of labeled images became available. And the rest is history, where today in 2019, neural networks are all over the place in AI that dominate the field, which is why I'm so excited that we have the opportunity tonight to hear from Yann himself about the latest development in this field. So please welcome Yann LeCun.
Thank you, Alex. A real pleasure to be here. This is not my first Cosyne, by the way. I've attended Cosyne a few times, 3 or 4 times or so, back when it was in Utah. Okay, let's see if this works. Okay, so this is going to be about machine learning, deep learning, convolutional nets, etc. But really, it's going to contain a lot of questions to you, which is, how is it that how could we make machines learn more like humans and animals? The type of learning that machines do today is not nearly as efficient as what we can observe in humans and animals, and I think it's probably the biggest mystery from my point of view is how it is that humans can learn so fast. So I'll come to this a little bit. Before, I'll sort of go through a little bit of a state of the art of deep learning today and what people now call AI. AI is nothing more than deep learning today, which is kind of weird. So most of the applications of what we call AI, the new AI today, is really supervised learning. And I'm sure you all know what supervised learning is in the context of machine learning. You show examples of, say, images or text or whatever to a machine, and then you tell it what the correct answer is. And through some sort of gradient-based algorithm, the machine changes its parameters, synaptic weights, if you think about them this way, that will get the outputs closer to the outputs you want. And you do this with millions of examples, and eventually the machine kind of settles on a set of parameters that seem to kind of abstract the notion of cars and airplanes and whatever else you're training them on. And it works really well for speech recognition, image recognition, face recognition, generating captions, translating a language into another. This is what powers Google and Facebook. You take supervised deep learning out of Facebook and Google today, both companies crumble. I'm not kidding. I mean, they're really built around it. And it all goes back to, of course, the early days of playing with artificial neural nets, the perceptron, the Adeline of the 1950s, which kind of set the stage for the standard model of pattern recognition that people in engineering and computer science have been using for decades. So it's the idea that you have a raw signal, let's say an image. It's just a bunch of pixels, an array of numbers, and you run it through a feature extractor, which in the past was built by hand. That generates a feature vector, which indicates the presence or absence of certain motifs, at certain locations. And then there is a trainable classifier that you stick on top of this, and that's the only place the only module that's trainable. What deep learning has done is kind of replace this model by this model at the bottom here, where every module in the system is trainable, and the very simple concept that if the modules are differentiable or quasi-differentiable, you can train everything using basically gradient descent. So you can estimate the gradient of whatever cost function you're optimizing with respect to all the parameters in the system and take a step. It's such a simple concept that it boggles the mind that it took so long to convince people this was a good idea. And I think a lot of people were kind of skeptical that things like this could work, basically. So inside of those, of course, all of this is inspired by old classic neuroscience. We're going to connect neurons to each other, and the weights are going to be adaptable, and you can think of the weights in a multilayer neural net as a matrix, and the activations of a neuron as kind of a vector, and then you pass it through an activation function. Now, there's an interesting idea, an interesting concept about the activation functions. The 1985 paper that Alex was mentioning, that I published in 1985, and there was an updated version in 86, is one in which I use something like the backpropagation algorithm, but instead of propagating gradients, I propagated targets. And the reason is because I was using binary neurons. Now, why is it that I was using binary neurons? It's not because of just macular pits. It's also because back in the old days, early 80s, putting your hands on a computer that could do fast floating point multiplication was kind of hard. I mean, those computers were expensive. I didn't have them. So I tried to use binary neurons so I could, run my neural net by just doing addition and subtraction. If you have binary activations, you don't need to do multiplications. So it's kind of weird to think that we are kind of prisoner of the concepts that are enabled by our hardware. But the hardware that we have at our disposal really determines the ideas that we allow ourselves to think of. And you can try to project back and think, why is it that backpropagation, which is such a simple concept, was not invented before? And the reason is because exactly the same reason people had the wrong neurons. They use binary neurons. You can't think of backpropagating gradients where your neurons are binary. So really what happened in the Remmelhart paper is that they started using sigmoid neurons. They were kind of in rich American universities where you could buy Lisp machines that could do fast floating point or Sun workstations. And that's what sort of made it possible. So what happened then, so for a couple decades, we used sigmoid neurons. And then one thing that changed about less than 10 years ago is that we shifted from using sigmoid neurons to using what we now call ReLU, which really is half-wave rectification, right? So it's a nonlinear mapping where if the argument is negative, the output is 0. If it's positive, it's just the identity function. And it's kind of how a neuron behaves in the kind of small signal regime, if you want. a neuron rarely goes to saturation unless you're an epileptic or something. So that's actually a more sort of biologically correct model of a neuron, but it also so happens that if you have those ReLU neurons, you can train neural nets using backprop with many, many more layers than you could with sigmoids. So sigmoids had kind of a bad property that they would saturate and things wouldn't converge properly. So it's not a conceptual revolution, but it enabled a lot of progress to just switch the type of neurons we're using, or the nonlinear mapping, really. Okay, so we do this with stochastic gradient descent, and backprop is just a practical application of chain rule, nothing really complicated in terms of the math, but again, it's really surprising that it took so long for people to realize this was a good idea. Okay, so very early on, I read a bunch of papers, the classic Hubel-Wiesel and various other papers like this, Fukushima's neurocognitron paper, and a few other things that basically had this concept that the visual system is composed of simple cells and complex cells, and perhaps with SSRD you can stack them up and sort of learn hierarchical representation, and that really was present in Fukushima's neurocognitron in the early 80s. And so I tried to build models like this for a while before I had sort of backprop running, if you want. But then as soon as backprop was kind of a known quantity, what I did is basically implement a system of this type that could be trained with backprop, and that's what convolutional nets are. So it's essentially the the sort of multi-stage Hubel-Wiesel type architecture where you have simple cells that are constrained to be, you kind of replicate them over the field, and you constrain them all to have the same weights, so that that's not very biologically plausible, but it makes the learning much faster and much easier. And then you have pooling operation, which initially we used something like average pooling. Now we use more like max pooling or LP pooling. There's various ways to do this. Arrow in the back here would advocate for L2 pooling. Take the square and sum and square root, but that's the energy model, etc. So you stack multiple layers of that, and then the representation as you go up the layers become more global, more abstract, and perhaps reflects a little bit what happens in the hierarchical, in the ventral pathway, in the hierarchy of the ventral pathway. So this is sort of a vintage convolutional net back from the early 90s that was trained to recognize Hamilton digits. I'm not showing the output layer here. But that's basically sort of the dream of a neurophysiologist, where you can actually observe the activation of every single neuron at every single time without having to poke electrodes in anyone's brain. And so every pixel here is an activation of a particular neuron. And as the layers are stacked from left to right, and as you get to the far right here, you get representations that are very distributed and basically represent the entire input. So this could recognize individual characters really well, record-breaking performance for the time. Pretty soon we realized that because this is a convolutional net and we only run convolutions, we can actually apply those networks to larger images and have them recognize multiple objects simultaneously, multiple characters in this case. And this was sort of a big breakthrough conceptually for us, because, although nobody else cared, but because what that demonstrated is that we don't need to have sort of prior segmentation of objects before recognizing them. They can be recognized in context with other objects surrounding them, perhaps with a background. And this was kind of a bit of a new thing for pattern recognition of the day, where basically every pattern recognition system had a way of separating the shape from the background and from the surrounding. We didn't have to do this. That allowed us to recognize characters that were touching each other, even kind of overlapping each other, and sort of automatically recognize what was where. The other thing that convinced me of, although I never wrote a paper on this, is that there were at the time very interesting theories in the context of theoretical neuroscience that attempted to explain how you do feature binding, right? Solving the feature binding problem. How does the brain figure out that the features here belongs to the 3 or the 5 or the 7 or the 1? Is there some explicit mechanism based on, for example, spike synchrony or something like this that sort of binds the feature together to form objects? And what this showed is that it's just, if you have just a few layers of nonlinear neurons, the system can basically do this without any special provision. So then, as Alex mentioned, there was a sort of dark age in the mid-90s, even though there were a lot of commercial success of this technique. Between 1995 and roughly 2005, there was essentially no activity around neural nets in the in the sort of machine learning community. There were, of course, sort of neural net conferences that were more sort of engineering-oriented, but not within machine learning, not within computer vision. There was no interest, and in fact, it was sort of laughed at, more or less. So what happened in around 2003, 2004 is that Jeff Hinton, Yoshua Bengio, and I got together and started a conspiracy, some sort of conspiracy, if you want, funded by a Canadian foundation to sort of attempt to rekindle the interest of the community in those methods. And what we did was bring together people who were interested not just in pattern recognition, computer vision, and machine learning, but also people who were interested in computational neuroscience. And so a number of people from this audience here attended some of those early workshops. And that was enough to create a bit of a community and interest in neural nets that kind of revived the field in the mid-2000s. But it was still very difficult to convince the computer vision community, for example, that those methods were good. So, for example, one experiment I did with my students in around 2008, 2009 was to train a convolutional net to do what's called semantic segmentation, which consists in labeling every pixel in an image with a category of the object it belongs to. And you can do this really easily with a convolutional net because you basically take a window of this image and you train the ConvNet to tell you what is the object category that the central pixel of this window belongs to. And swiping a window computed by a convolutional net over an entire image is very, very cheap. So we could do this very fast. We even had special hardware to run it at 20 frames per second. You do this at multiple scale. And so there was a standard data set with only a few thousand images here that we ran this thing on, trained it on, and beat the record that was previously published with sort of more classical computer vision techniques. And as you can see, it's not perfect. It's classifying some areas here as sand or desert. And this is the middle of Manhattan. There's no beach I'm aware of, but this is actually Washington Square Park. But this was the best system at the time. We submitted it to CVPR in 2012, and the 3 reviews trashed it, basically. The paper was soundly rejected, even though it was better than everything else published, even though it was faster by a factor of 50, even without special hardware. It was completely trashed, and the reviewer said, basically, we don't believe that a method we never heard of can work so well. I mean, that's what it came down to. I'm schematizing here, but but in the meantime, things started kind of rolling in the machine learning community, and people started to get interested in those methods, and there were, those ideas eventually a few years later sort of were picked up by companies that work on autonomous driving, and a lot of the self-driving cars that are kind of being worked on right now use techniques very similar to this for detecting objects and figuring out where the car can drive and things like that. Okay, and then in 2012, this was the second time that Jeff Hinton scooped me. We're still very good friends. Where, we'd been working on convolutional net for a long time, and Jeff had been working on neural nets for a long time, but hadn't really been playing with convolutional net for that long. But he had this student, Alex Krzyzewski, who was really, really good at implementing convolutional nets on GPUs. So it wasn't the first person to do this. Patrice Simard at Microsoft had done it before, and Enjoying also at Stanford had done it a year before. So, and Jürgen Schmidhuber and various other groups, and we tried it too, but our implementation wasn't that great. So what Alex managed to do is do a really efficient implementation of convolutional nets on GPU, and immediately they participated in the ImageNet competition. We would have participated the year after, but we got scooped, basically. And we did participate the year after. And they beat the pants out of everything else. So with this big convolutional net, which was much bigger than everything we had trained before by at least a factor of 10, and many layers, something like 8 layers or something like this, about 1 billion connections, 1 billion synapses, if you want. And so the previous record, which is the so-called top 5 error rate on the ImageNet dataset, was about 26%, and they brought it down to 16%. And the announcement of this result was at a workshop in Florence, the ECCV conference, and you could see, a lot of people from the computer vision community. There was like a big switch in their head that went clunk, and a lot of them stopped everything they were doing and started using convolutional nets, to the point that now, only 2 years after this occurred, You basically couldn't get a paper accepted as CVPR unless you use convolutional nets, which is sort of the complete opposite of what happened just 3 years before with our paper. So that's really a revolution. And that kind of spurred a whole industry of applications of this because, it's computer vision that works. So what we've seen also is an inflation in the number of layers and a lot of innovation in terms of the particular architectures that people have been proposing. So in 2013 was the VGG network from Oxford, 2014 GoogleNet, which is kind of a play on word from Google, ResNet in 2015 from Kang-Ming He from Microsoft Research Asia, which really brought the performance to kind of a new high. And DanceNet is kind of a variation of ResNet produced at Facebook and Cornell. Kang-Ming He now works at Facebook. And this is a chart that was put together by Alfredo Conziani, who's now a postdoc in my lab, that represents the number of billions of operations on the x-axis that is required to compute one of those convolutional nets. And on the y-axis, the top one, accuracy on ImageNet. So top left is great. And then the size of the disk is the memory occupation, if you want, of the memory footprint of this neural net. And what you see is that as people build a better intuition about what's good in those architectures, things are kind of moving to the top and to the left, to the point now that ImageNet is really not an interesting benchmark anymore because the accuracy is better than humans, essentially. It doesn't mean those systems have superhuman visual performance, right? But it's, at least for this data set, they do. Now, this is actually of critical importance for practical applications because, as I said before, those things are used absolutely all the time by companies like Facebook and Google. So just an example for Facebook, there's a few billion photos that are uploaded on Facebook every day by Facebook users. I'm not talking about Instagram or Messenger or anything, just the blue website. A few billion per day. Every single one of those, within 2 seconds of being uploaded, goes through a handful of convolutional nets that do things like tag the image, sort of, figures out, like, is it a birthday party? Is it, a landscape? Is it indoors? Is there, a boat in it? Is there a Louis Vuitton bag in it? I mean, there's something like a few thousand tags that the system can identify. It also extracts a very compact feature vector that can be used then to index that image through search, to find copies, things like that. It also goes through a system that does face recognition, if you have this enabled, one that generates captions for the visually impaired, and one, of course, that does kind of questionable content filtering, hate speech, nudity, things like that. And then another one that actually detects the text in the images and reads the text using character recognition, also using a convolutional net. And the reason for this is that you have neo-Nazi groups that basically don't post neo-Nazi text. They write it in an image and then post the image. So you're going to have to, if you want to take down hateful content, you're going to have to do that. Okay, so a lot of cycles are burned running convolutional nets, and there is a lot of work now in the hardware industry to kind of provide processors that are really particularly efficient for this. Okay, so there's been a lot of progress, more recent progress now. We don't just do image recognition. We can do things that are pretty amazing, which I find really amazing, with conceptually simple convolutional nets, essentially. Particular architecture is called mask-RCNN here, that does what's called instance segmentation with mask. I'm not going to bore you with details, but it's a very simple, large convolutional net you apply to an image, and then it identifies regions of interest where there might be in the feature space when there might be interesting objects, and then it just kind of applies a classifier to each of those locations. And it can produce results like this, which are kind of really amazing, where, so every person is outlined and identified as a person, the wine glasses, the computers in the back, the backpacks and the umbrellas, it can count how many sheep there are in the image on the right. It's really quite amazing, and people in computer vision sort of didn't expect that this kind of progress would happen that fast. All of this is open source, by the way, so if you want to use this as kind of a model for how the brain kind of computes, you can just download it. And in fact, there's been quite a lot of work from this community on sort of trying to figure out, can we use convolutional net as a model of how the visual system works, at least the ventral pathway, because what a lot of those systems are basically emulating is the ventral pathway, even though they're trying to do localization, which is not what the ventral pathway is doing. things like the work by Yamins and DiCarlo a few years ago of so trying to figure out if you can explain what you observe in electrophysiology with a particular type of sort of trained convolutional net. Work by Eckenberg et al. In Neuroimage 2016, where they tried to sort of explain the variance in fMRI experiments using kind of convolutional nets as the thing that would explain the activity. And then they showed that if you try to see which layer in a typical convolutional net best explains the activity of each area in the visual cortex, you get this sort of natural hierarchy that V1 is better explained by the lower layers, and V2 by layers above, and V4 by layers above, and IT by kind of the top layers where object categories are encoded, which is really cool. Very recently, this paper from Surya Ganguly's group and a couple of people at Google, I believe, on kind of trying to build a more sort of biologically correct architecture. So something that would have a few layers that behave kind of like a retina and LGN, and then have some sort of information bottleneck at that point, because you only have 1 million fibers coming out of the eye, and see what features naturally emerge when you train this thing end-to-end in supervised mode, which of course is not what the brain is doing, but that's kind of a good experiment. And what they show is that unless you have a very tight bottleneck, basically with just one feature map at the output of the retina-like network, you're not going to get center surround. You're going to get more diverse features. So the only way to get center surround is basically if you have only one type of feature coming out of your retina. And then kind of subsequent layers kind of behave a bit more like V1 and things like this. So all of this is done with supervised learning, but really it's sort of difficult for me to believe. And having hung out with Jeff Hinton for a while, he's always been a big proponent of unsupervised learning, or at least something else than supervised learning. So what babies learn, they learn mostly by observation in what seems to be sort of a non-task-oriented way. So something we can call unsupervised, or perhaps self-supervised. So of course, sort of a big contribution in computational neuroscience is kind of, Olshausen-Field, 1997, right? You can learn filters that look like V1. They're not filters, they're like back filters, so they are things that reconstruct the image from a hidden representation. And the only thing you need to do is essentially insist that the representation be sparse, only a few components be on. But let me, before I talk about this, let me back up a little bit and explain a bit of perhaps a more general framework of how my view of unsupervised learning. So basically, imagine that your world consists of 2 pixels, right? So you have Y1, Y2, you have 2 eyes, you have 1 pixel per eye, and your entire universe consists of those data points. Those black dots here are those data points. So obviously, there is some dependency between the 2 pixels that you see from your left and right eye. And unsupervised learning would consist in capturing the dependency between those 2 pixels and perhaps extract some useful representation from it. So it can come down to doing things like predicting Y1, predicting Y2 from Y1 or Y1 from Y2, or having some sort of contrast function that takes low values on the data and higher values outside the data. So if you had a contrast function that had kind of this shape, that took low values on the data point and higher value outside, and if you could train it, so this is sort of meant to describe the training process here. You start with a flat energy function, you feed it Y1, Y2, and it says 0 all the time, and then you train it in such a way that it takes high values on stuff you don't observe and low values on stuff you observe. Now it turns out a lot of classical unsupervised learning algorithms like k-means, PCA, sparse coding, etc., can be formulated in very simple terms within this kind of view of sort of energy-based view of things. If you place yourself again in 2 dimension, and now your data set are points that are sampled around this little spiral here, right? So your training set is a bunch of points around this spiral, and you train a PCA on this. So the energy function in PCA is a reconstruction error of every point in your space. PCA is going to find the principal axis of this data set, and so the dark region here is where the principal axis resides. And the energy is simply the distance to that point. And so you get this energy function here where dark means low energy and white means high energy. For k-means basically trains itself to put prototypes where there is data. So it's going to put a bunch of data points around this spiral and give them low energy. And everything else will have higher energy because you only have k data points that you can place. So that's the energy function you get here. And so what's interesting about this is that depending on what form of unsupervised learning algorithm you want to use, it's very simple to train a machine so it gives you low energy on stuff you train it on, right? If you have a parameterized function, show it a sample, tweak the parameters so that the output goes down. Super simple. The problem is how you make sure that the energy function takes higher values outside of the data points that you train it on. And I've sort of figured out there's basically 8 different types, 7 or 8 different ways to do this. One of them here is not listed. That would be adversarial training, although you can see it as a special case of number 2. I'm not going to go through all of them, but basically everything that people do in unsupervised learning is one of those. So to give you an example, perhaps that many of you know about, let's talk about the Auto-Encoders type model, which I describe as a decoder-only model. So you have a latent representation Z. It's a vector. And it goes through a regularizer, which is basically the L1 norm, the sum of the absolute values of the components of Z. And that's something that takes low value when the number of components of Z that are non-zero is small. Then that goes through a linear decoder to just multiply Z by a matrix, and then compute the reconstruction error between the data point you observe, Y, and the reconstructed data point, Y prime. And given a Y, the name of the game here is to find the value of Z that minimizes this reconstruction error. That's the inference problem. And then once you have that, to train the decoder, you just do one step of gradient descent in the reconstruction error. Okay, very simple. You also have to guarantee that this decoder doesn't blow up, so you have to kind of limit the amplitude of the weights. If you do this, you get energy functions like this, where the sort of low energy surface is kind of a piecewise linear thing, if you want. That works really well in high dimension. There's a problem, which is that inference is slow. So if I give you a Y, you have to run this optimization algorithm that minimizes the reconstruction error plus the L1 term to find the Z that represents it. It's not something that goes on in the brain when you do fast recognition. There's just no time for this, right? Simon Thorpe was sitting here and says there's barely enough time for a few spikes to go through. So it's got to be feedforward. So an idea we had quite a while ago was to basically train a neural net that you can call an encoder to predict quickly what the solution to this kind of sparse coding problem is. It turns out you can do this very efficiently. So you can have an encoder neural net here with just a few layers, 2, 3, something like that. That will give you a really good approximation of the sparse code that optimally reconstructs the image. We had a particular version of this called predictive sparse decomposition that used kind of something like a target propagation rather than a backprop, but that's kind of a detail. We could never actually get it accepted anywhere. And we ended up putting it on archive 2 years later. But eventually, we built a version of this that could do convolutional sparse autoencoders. So essentially, what it amounts to is, Auto-Encoders trains a bunch of filters at a patch level. But we wanted to basically do this as a way to pre-train convolutional nets. So take a whole image, put a bunch of neurons that are all identical, V1-like neurons if you want, but they're generative neurons, so they're going to produce each of them is going to produce a patch, but they're all identical, and you get a bunch of them combining to produce a single patch. And you're going to train this whole thing with the same idea as Auto-Encoders, except the operation now, instead of being just a linear multiplication of a matrix by a vector, is multiple convolutions of feature maps by convolution kernels. And then we combine this with this idea of having an encoder that does a fast prediction for the sparse code, and we train this whole thing simultaneously, so you can think of this as a sparse autoencoder. And this is the kind of early results that we got. So on the left are the filters in the encoder that you get if you train at the patch level, and on the right are the filters that you get if you train convolutionally. And what you see is much more diversity in the convolutional learning, and it's because the system knows that it has a copy of the filter at every location, so it doesn't need to generate 10 different versions of a vertical bar detector. It already has all 10 of them replicated over the field. And so instead of spending all of its efforts, learning different positions or registrations, if you want, of all the filters, it spends its resources learning new filters. And so what you see here on the right is that you have center surround, oriented edges, crosses, corners, gradings. I mean, it's super diverse, right? Probably more diverse even than what you can find in V1, or maybe not what you can find in V1. So pretty cool. And this is what you get. So this is sort of echoing the kind of Surya-Ganguly's experiment, where here we train one of those sparse convolutional autoencoder with one filter. What you get is just basically center surround. 2 filters, you get slightly offset center surround. 4 filters, you get bipolar horizontal and bipolar vertical edge detectors. 8 filters, which is the next line. And by the way, on the left are the encoder filters, on the right are the decoder basis functions with which the image is reconstructed. So with the 8 filters, you get, of course, oriented edges at 45 degrees angle, basically. And as soon as you go to 16, you start seeing center surround and orientation selectivity. 32, you start seeing kind of a finer grain of angles. And then with 64, you see all kinds of stuff. Different frequencies, kind of positive, negative, kind of up-down filters, things like that, multiple waves. So this is really cool. And the time it takes for this to learn, if you kind of translate this in sort of real time of life, if you want, like, thinking that the brain, can do an update maybe 5 or 10 times per second, this is minutes, all right? You can learn filters like this in minutes of life, if you want, with those unsupervised learning procedures, which asks an interesting question, right? There is a lot of, I don't know if it's a debate, but sort of agreement that a lot of those things are kind of hardwired in the brain and maybe they're present at birth, etc. It would be very, very hard to figure out, actually, because, as soon as, baby opens her eyes, that it's there within minutes. Now, of course, you can do this in the womb with animals and it's present, but, you could imagine that sort of waves are, patterns are generated inside the womb that sort of pre-train those things. So you kind of have a head start. Now, this is good for simple cells. What about complex cells? Can we learn complex cells the same way? And, there is an old paper by Hivarinen and Hoyer on group sparsity, which has this idea of using ICA with group sparsity to kind of learn complex cell-like schemes. So here, the sparse autoencoder, which I kind of symbolize here, so you have the encoder at the bottom, you have the decoder at the top, the reconstruction error, and then the sparsity is not on individual components of the code, but on groups of components. So you take a group of components, you compute the sum of the square root of sum of the square. You do this for a bunch of groups, and then that's your sparsity criterion. That's what you regularize the system with. So the system wants to make that vector as short as possible, if you want, which means it wants to make it have a lot of zeros in it. So it turns out that works really well, particularly if you group the code unit. So this is trained at the patch level, so this is not convolutional anymore. But you take the code units, and you invent some sort of 2D topology in them, and the groups are overlapping groups of 36 units that overlap by 12. And what happens now is the system tries to regroup to learn features in such a way that all the features within a group fire together, which means they're going to detect very similar features. Okay, and so if you train such a system and you look at the filters that are learned completely unsupervised on a few image patches, you get those kind of pinwheely-like patterns. So this is actually trained with a toric topology. So the left side meets the right side and the top meets the bottom. So if you actually replicate this multiple times, you start seeing things that are more pinwheely, not entirely, but sort of. Then following up on this work, just a year later, or a couple of years later, we started, we kind of work on a very similar model, also with a kind of an encoder predictor, a sparsity criterion, and a decoder. But then the architecture here is that we have local receptive fields spread over a large area, and they of an image, and they're not there's no shared weights. So there's local connection, but no shared weights. And it's not trained at the patch level. It's trained at the image level. There's a certain degree of completeness in the representation. And when you do this, you get, so this is the natural topology, image topology of the input, where I think a group of 4 neurons basically see the same, you know, 4 neighboring neurons see the same patch on the input. And you have, again, this kind of group sparsity type criterion for the sparse autoencoder. So now you start to see kind of, you know, more sort of pinwheely type organization. This is perhaps a better representation of it. You can even try to fit oriented wavelets to those filters and see, and then color code them, and then, you know, figure out what they do. So the picture on the left is really resulting from this algorithm, and from the right is taken from, you know, the biological neurophysiology literature. That's better, maybe a better picture of that. Okay. Moving along, the next idea is an idea that actually goes back to work in theoretical neuroscience a long time. Jeff Hinton had this idea in the early 80s, as well as Christoph von der Meisburg. This is the idea that somehow you have kind of a separation in representation of the what and the where, which, you know, of course, is maybe something that happens in the ventral and dorsal pathway, but maybe even at the level of kind of low-level representation, where the code that allows you to kind of reconstruct an image is composed of a code that represents the object category and another code that represents the position of that object. And then you have some sort of multiplicative interaction between the two to produce an object of a particular type at a particular location. So the overall architecture is a little complicated, and I'm not going to explain all the details. But what I'm going to say is that essentially this is trained in kind of semi-supervised way by exploiting temporal constancy. So you show patches from a video to that system, and you tell it you can change the where from one frame to the next, but you're not allowed to change the what. Okay, so the what code is on the right, and the where codes are the 3 codes here, CT, CT-1, CT-2. Those are 3 frames from the past, and the system is allowed to change that. Of course, if you don't put any constraint on those Cs, all the information goes through that, and the where actually, I mean, the what doesn't contain anything. So what you have to do is kind of push down on the information content of the where, of the CT, T-1, T-2, so that as much information as possible goes to the what. And you can do this with sparsity. So just put a L1 criterion, and what happens there is there's sort of a natural separation of the what and the where, just completely unsupervised fashion. So you get filters kind of like this, where here the filters are organized according to the strength of the weight connecting them to the what or to the where. And so if you take if you look at the bottom chart, the first row is a bunch of vertical edge detectors at various locations. Okay, so those are basically detectors of vertical edges that are pooled by a unit that doesn't care about position. Right. And then all of the filters in the various rows are basically different registrations of kind of the same type of detector, but at different locations, right? So that sort of naturally organizes itself this way. So it's just sort of not particularly biologically plausible. Maybe it is, but I mean, it's using backprop all the way, right? Here's another idea, which is the idea of using explicitly kind of lateral inhibition. And again, this was done around the same time, perhaps a year later, where instead of having an L1 sparsity, we just insist that we build a lateral inhibition matrix, the S matrix here, and compute the quadratic form of the code vector transpose times this matrix times the code vector. You can think of this as some sort of like Hopfield energy-like thing, if you want, or negative energy. And what you do there is you train the system in such a way that at inference time, the Z that is produced is the Z that minimizes the sum of those two. But during training, you're trying to learn the S as well as the W so that the S is as large as possible. And again, if you do this right, you get, kind of, when those lateral inhibition have some sort of 2D topology, you get sort of naturally kind of smoothly varying features. Yeah, this is different different types of lateral inhibitions. This is yet another one where you have lateral inhibition at multiple scales, and you get different. You get short range excitation plus L1, actually, plus inhibition. Okay, so those things were things that we thought would have perhaps even practical applications, would allow us to pre-train very deep networks. It turns out you can just do this with backprop, and so a lot of those things kind of went dormant around 2012 when ImageNet was beaten and everybody rushed to just training convolutional nets, classical convolutional nets. So that we put on hold a little bit, but I've been coming back to this kind of idea for the last several years. But before I go there, there's of course a lot of excitement in the machine learning community, as well as I imagine in computational neuroscience for reinforcement learning. And perhaps some people have said that really the way animals and humans learn is through reinforcement learning, perhaps some form of deep reinforcement learning. I don't buy this. I don't buy it for the following reason. I mean, reinforcement learning is useful, indispensable. It's a great topic of study. We're working on it at Facebook, and it's great. There's a lot of useful applications of it too, but it's not sufficient by itself. And let me point out why. So it works really well for games, and it works for games because you can run games at whatever speed you want on how many machines you want. If you have 2,000 GPUs or I don't know how many thousands of TPUs, you can run. You can train the best Go player in the world. But let's take a very simple problem: getting a machine to learn to play Atari games, so the old classic Atari games. So this is a chart from a paper from a team at DeepMind, actually, from a couple of years ago. And what's interesting in this chart is that it shows the equivalent real time it would take for a machine using the best reinforcement learning algorithms as of 2 years ago to learn to play Atari game. And the best a combined algorithm can do is basically 80 hours of training to reach a performance that basically any human can reach in about 15 minutes. Okay, so that tells you, okay, I mean, there's a lot of arguments. Humans come with a lot of, baggage, and they already know how to do vision, and they know how to press buttons and stuff. But that tells you perhaps we're missing something more fundamental. A lot of people have been working, because of the excitement around self-driving cars, a lot of people have been trying to use reinforcement learning to get machines to drive themselves. And it's kind of hopeless. If you were to use the sort of best current forms of RL to train a machine to drive itself, a car to drive itself, it would have to, practice for, millions of hours, kill a few tens of thousands of pedestrians and crash, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of cars, and run off a cliff a few thousand times before it figures out it's a bad idea. Now, how is it that any human can learn to drive a car in 20 hours of training without crashing, mostly, right? Most of us. And this is a crucial question because, until we've solved that problem, until we've figured this out, we're not going to have like completely reliable self-driving car that drive at level 5, which is completely autonomous. And there's a bunch of things we're not going to have. We're not going to have intelligent personal assistants that have common sense. We're not going to have, even a agile robot that has as much common sense as your house cat, right? Our best AI systems don't come close. So how is it that humans and animals learn so quickly in particular? Okay, so, let's look at babies. Now, babies learn an enormous amount of background information about the world just by observation, essentially. I mean, they're kind of helpless from the motor control point of view, so all they can do is learn by observation, and they learn an enormous amount of background knowledge and common sense. So if you show, very basic things like gravity, right? You show a baby 5 months old or so, the scenario on the top left here, where there's a little car on a platform, you push the car off the platform, the car kind of floats in the air, appears to float in the air. It's a trick, of course. 5 months baby says, sure, that's how the world works. A 9 months baby goes like the little girl at the bottom left, because in the meantime, she's learned that objects are not supposed to float in the air, they're supposed to fall. So in fact, Emmanuel Dupuy, who's a cognitive scientist in Paris, who spends a bit of time at Facebook, put together this chart that sort of indicates roughly at what age, these are supposed to be ranges actually, babies learn sort of basic concepts like object permanence and stability and the difference between biological motion and sort of static object, or not moving kind of inanimate objects. And then gravity, inertia, conservation of momentum, that kind of stuff, intuitive physics, that comes around 7 months or so, between 7 and 9 months. He's got a similar chart for sort of linguistic and interaction, social things. And it's not just humans, right? Animals do the same. So look at this baby orangutan here. It's being played a magic trick. Put an object in a cup, shake the cup, remove the object, then show the empty cup to the ape, and he falls on the floor laughing. Okay, so this is a baby orangutan, right? It's figured out that objects are not supposed to just disappear. And so he is very captivated by this magic trick. So how is it that he learned this, right? And cats or rats have kind of similar things that they learn. So the salvation, I think, is in things that I call self-supervised learning. And what I told you about earlier, those kind of sparse autoencoders, are sort of an example of that, an instance of this, if you want. So what is self-supervised learning? It's the process by which you give to the machine or the entity that is learning a piece of data. For the sake of the argument here, let's think of this as a piece of a video, for example, a video clip. Okay, so time is one of the dimensions, space are the other 2 dimensions in that case, but it could be anything. And you're going to ask the machine to predict, to pretend it doesn't know a piece of that data, and you're going to ask it to predict that piece of data that it pretends it doesn't know. Of course, it knows it, right? You just need to wait to know what the future of the video clip is going to be. So you can ask the machine to predict the future from the present and the past, ask the machine to predict the past from the present, particularly if you want to train the machine to be a police inspector or something like this. We get into a room, like what happened, right? Things like that, right? Or just fill in blocked areas in an image. That's called in-painting. And why is it? Why would it be such an interesting concept? It's because now when you're the samples are cheap, millions of videos or whatever from YouTube or Facebook or whatever, right? It's unlimited amount of data. And the amount of information you ask the machine to predict for every sample, every training sample, is very large. You basically, if this is a video clip of a few seconds, you're asking the machine to predict, half of the frames in this video clip. That's a lot of pixels. And so you're giving it a lot of information, you're asking it to predict that information, therefore it's going to have to basically consume a lot of resources to do this. And in the process, it will learn perhaps very sort of important concept about how the world works. Let me take a very concrete example. If I train my brain to predict what the world is going to look like when I move my head to the left or to the right by 10 or 20 centimeters, the best explanation for how the world changes, or how my view of the world changes when I move my head, is the fact that every object has a depth, right? If I can sort of abstract the notion of depth and somehow estimate or compute a depth for every object in my field of view, then I can very easily compute what the world is going to look like when I move my head and minimize the prediction error of what is the world going to be like a second from now after I've moved my head. Okay, so that's a very simple example that shows that a very simple sort of prediction criterion will drive the machine to learn sort of an abstract representation of something that's really important. Okay, learning that the world is three-dimensional, that's pretty important. Of course, you have 2 eyes, you do it, without moving your head. Now, this is not a new idea. The idea that prediction is the basis of intelligence. Again, Jeff Hinton has been talking about this for a few decades, and Rich Sutton also, and a bunch of other people. Right? It's not new by far. But that led me to this kind of slightly obnoxious view of learning, where if you kind of measure the amount of information that a machine or an entity is given for every each of the 3 paradigms of learning, either self-supervised or supervised or reinforced. Reinforcement learning, you're telling the machine once in a while, you did good, you did bad, right? It's one scalar value once in a while. And it's not even a differentiable cost function, so you can't do backprop. You have to basically try several things and figure out what works best. It's super inefficient. That's why you're never going to get self-driving cars that are trained in the real world by reinforcement learning. They can be trained by reinforcement learning in simulators if our simulators are fast enough. Supervised learning requires people to produce labeled data, and so that's kind of limited too in terms of information content. It's only a few numbers, right, per sample. Self-supervised learning, you're asking the machine to predict a lot of stuff, so presumably it's going to be able to learn a lot of interesting concepts. So people have been kind of catching up on this concept, for example, in computer vision, with the idea of in-painting pieces of an image that is masked. And this is sort of an indication of a few papers over the years where some progress has been made in this idea of in-painting here. That's using convolutional nets, basically autoencoder type convolutional nets of various types. A domain where it's been extremely successful is text. So some of the best text understanding systems today use a form of pre-training. So there's a model, for example, from Google called BERT. There's several models that have names of Sesame Street characters. There's Elmo and whatever. And the idea, that's basically a masked autoencoder. So it's very much the process that I described, where you give the system a sequence of words, you mask 15% of the words, you don't tell the machine what they are, and then you run through this kind of autoencoder-like machine, and at the end, you ask it to predict what those words that are missing were. So it's supervised learning, and it works really well because we know how to represent uncertainty in a distribution over words, right? The dictionary in English has, or the practical one has, 100,000 words, or maybe a couple of 100,000. We can do a discrete distribution over 100,000 variables. That's really not a problem nowadays. So that works because we know how to handle uncertainty. It doesn't quite work, at least not as well, if we try to do this for video prediction. So let's say we want to train a system to predict what happens in a video. We train it on lots of different video clips. And here we show 4 video frames to a machine and ask it to predict the last 2 frames. And if we just do this with least square as the training criterion, what you get are those blurry predictions. Why is it? It's because the system cannot predict exactly what's going to happen. So the best it can do is predict the average of all the possible things that are going to happen. So if I take a pen and I let it drop on the table, every time I repeat the experiment, it's going to drop in the different directions. And so the average of all the experiments is going to be this sort of transparent circle of pens here, whereas none of those is the correct answer, right? So the main technical issue of really making progress in self-supervised learning today, in my opinion, is how we solve this problem of predicting under uncertainty in high-dimensional continuous spaces. So the next revolution will not be supervised in AI, that's for sure. It won't be reinforced either. This concept I stole from Elia Shaefros, the concept of this slide. And we've done a little bit of work in that direction, so learning predictive models of the world. There's several reasons for this. One, because we'd like to kind of solve this problem of kind of learning self-supervised learning models with uncertainty, but also because we'd like to use those models to be able to basically have machines that can learn to drive a car by kind of thinking in their head what are the consequences of their actions before they do it, and therefore not do stupid things like run off cliffs. Okay? In the context of reinforcement learning, that's called model-based reinforcement learning, and the complex thing about model-based reinforcement learning is how you learn the model. It's not how you do the reinforcement. I mean, that's what's so hard, but okay. So basically, an intelligent agent should have kind of a world simulator in its head. And for a neuroscientist, it's kind of obvious, right? Basically, the entire front half of our brain are kind of our world simulator. It's our model of the world. And the rest is just, perception or action, essentially. And so, what we can do is kind of think in our head using our world simulator about, what's going to happen when we take a particular action and then sort of optimally plan this action, which, of course, people in optimal control have known for a long time. If you have a perfect simulator of the world, you can just run your world simulator and then optimally plan a sequence of action that will satisfy a particular criterion, minimize energy or whatever. So the trick here is how you handle uncertainty in the prediction of world models. And what you need, essentially, to do this is a model with latent variables. So you need a model that perhaps takes the state of the world as observation. Let's call this X. And then it will not produce a single prediction, but it's going to be asked to produce a whole set of predictions. And the way you parameterize this set of prediction is through a latent variable that we're going to call Z here. And so as Z varies within a set or within a distribution, the output Y varies within a set, which is a set of all plausible predictions of, in this case, the future, if it's a future prediction. So one way to do this is using adversarial training. I don't have time to explain what it is, and many of you probably already know, and I'm kind of getting close to being out of time. And so this was proposed by Yann Goodfellow in 2014, and the idea there is that you train an objective function simultaneously with the predictor, you train an objective function to tell you whether the prediction is on this ribbon of plausible future or not. You train those two things simultaneously. So this discriminator is that function. I kind of formulate this in this sort of energy-based framework here, where the discriminator is given something that really occurs in the world, like the future frame from the video, and you train the discriminator to produce a small output. And then you feed it with predictions from the generator, and you tell the discriminator to essentially produce higher energy for things that are produced by the generator, which of course are fake initially because the generator doesn't know better. Okay, so you can view this as a form of energy-based learning, as I explained earlier, except it's a form where the way the contrastive points with energy you're going to push up are produced is through training a generator neural net. So as the discriminator trains itself, it learns this function, and the generator is going to use gradients backpropagated through the discriminator to actually move the green points towards the blue points. And so that's how those two things kind of train with each other. And this works amazingly well in the sense that you can train a large convolutional net with a particular architecture. You feed it random numbers, and out comes this. Okay? Each of those guys, gals, is a non-existing person that's produced from a vector of 512 random numbers, essentially. Incredibly realistic. If you're really careful, you can tell they're fake, but you have to, there's actually a website you can go to. They'll show you two images and ask you which one is fake, and with a little bit of training, you can tell. You can do things like, so we have people at Facebook in Paris who are in Paris, and so necessarily they work on fashion. So those are kind of, fashion pieces generated by one of those generative networks. You feed it random numbers, and that comes this. It's been trained with a large collection of fashion pieces from a well-known designer whose name I will not reveal. And you can do video prediction. These are kind of early work on video prediction from several years ago. You can also do video prediction not on pixels, which is perhaps overkill a little bit, but in a space produced by a computer vision system that already identifies and localizes objects. So this is trying to predict where objects around you, cars in that example, are going to go or are going to move in advance, after those cars have been kind of localized, and then you train a system to imagine where those cars are going to be, a few seconds later. It does a decent job, and it knows the bike on the right here is going to keep going, and it doesn't realize that the car at the bottom here on the left is going to accelerate, so the shadow of the car trails behind it. Okay, so perhaps we can use those things to help a machine to learn to drive. This is a project done at NYU with now former student and postdoc of mine very recently. This is going to be a paper at iClear in a couple of months. And what we have here is a data set where we look at a highway from the top, and with standard vision techniques, we can track all the cars. So we have this picture here at the bottom where every car is a different green block, if you want, and the lanes are indicated in red. And then we take every car as kind of a central car, if you want, and we kind of cut a little rectangle around them, and we try to train a neural net to predict what the cars around a given car are going to do. So basically here is my car is the blue car, and I watch other cars moving and buses and whatever moving around it, and then I train a convolutional net with one of those latent variable techniques that I'm not going to explain to predict the next frame or the next few frames in what the cars are going to do around me. This is very useful if you want to learn to drive, to be able to predict what other cars are going to do. So there's several ways to handle the latent variables here, which I don't have time to explain because I'm already out of time. These are the kind of predictions you get. So on the left, so there's two blocks here. Each block has 4 columns. The leftmost thing is actual data observed. The second one is a prediction if you use a completely deterministic model that doesn't have latent variables, so it just tries to predict, but it has to predict the average of all the things that can happen, and it gets blurred out really quickly. And the other two are predictions that are obtained with latent variables from 2 different samplings of the latent variable. Okay, and so you get different futures from those 2 different samplings. Now the cool thing about this is that you can compute an objective function here for good driving, which consists in like not being too close to other cars and not changing lane too often, staying in your lane, etc. And there's no reinforcement learning whatsoever here. This is all taking place in the head of this neural net. You start with a real-world situation. You run this predictive forward model forward. You compute the cost at every time step. You sample the latent variable at every time step. So you get kind of a imagined potential future. And through gradient descent, you backpropagate through another network, which is a policy network that's going to try to predict the best action that's going to minimize the overall expected cost over the entire trajectory. And you do this for, you run the trajectory for a few seconds. If you do this, it doesn't work at all. What happens is the policy network learns to basically go in regions of the model that where the model does really, really bad predictions, but the cost happens to be low. Okay? So you have to introduce another term in the cost, inside of the cost function, which is how certain the forward model is of its predictions. And you can easily do this in a differentiable way. You basically draw several samples of dropout in the network that makes the prediction and measure the variance of it, and that's one term in the cost function. So now the network is trying to stay in situations where it can actually predict reliably. And these are examples of this car driving. So there are 5 different examples. The little white dot is whether the car is accelerating, braking, or turning. You have to realize that this car is actually invisible to the other cars. The other cars are recorded cars. And the blue car, of course, is driven, but the other cars don't see it because it's just been kind of plugged into this environment. So there are accidents that occur because it's getting squeezed. But it does a pretty good job at like merging on when other cars are kind of coming to the highway and accelerating when cars behind are too close and things like that. Okay, so time for me to conclude. So model-free reinforcement learning is really too slow in the real world. It requires too many blind interactions. That's the first thing. The solution probably is some sort of model-based reinforcement learning, but then the question is how do you learn the model? And that's the hard question really at this time. Regularized latent variable energy-based models, a mouthful, are a good way to learn features in an unsupervised fashion. And some of the models I showed here kind of belong to this category also of sort of sparse or regularized latent variable models, even though I didn't have time to explain. The networks we're going to train with this are going to be much, much bigger than the ones we have today. So we're kind of waiting for the hardware people to deliver sort of more efficient hardware to train neural nets. But we'll have an unlimited amount of data to train them. They'll have sparse activation, very likely, because of those regularization techniques, perhaps. And we hope the hardware that's going to come up is going to be able to take advantage of those sparse activations the way the brain does it. Learning models of the world accelerates learning of motor tasks and actually makes them possible, possibly. Perhaps the old idea that prediction is the essence of intelligence might be true. At least I bought that message. Thank you very much. So I'm not sure what's going on now. Do we have questions?
Could you? Let me just announce one operational thing. So we have Lynn and Inesh with their microphones. So people who want some questions to ask questions, please go towards them. That's the idea.
So Yann, we know that at the end of the day, when you are in the penultimate layer, the last transformation is either going to be a linearly separable transformation for a classification problem or an affine transformation for a regression problem. So the whole job of the network is to make the representation such that by the time you get there, you can exploit this linearity. We know from kernel methods that making wide representations, increasing the dimensionality of the hidden layers, is a good way to achieve that. So could you comment into this trade-off, about the trade-off between making wide layers versus making many layers, a deep network?
It's not a trade-off. It's a choice. So that's actually a very interesting story. So the kind of neural nets that people were training back in the 80s were relatively small, relatively narrow. It turns out the way to make neural nets work really well is to make them really wide, really over-parameterized for the problem. because you create all kinds of extra dimensions that make the optimization problem simpler. Now, of course, if you talk to a statistician, they will tell you, but that's kind of crazy because now you have a widely overparameterized model and it's never going to generalize. That turns out to be wrong for neural nets. They turn out, the bigger you make them, the better they work, even though they might be overparameterized. And the reason why this is happening is not entirely clear. There's a lot of really interesting questions around this of why is it that neural nets, like convolutional nets in particular, generalize even with a relatively small number of training samples that is way, way smaller than the number of parameters. Actually, Surya Ganguly has interesting papers on this.
So, hi, this is Min Song from the KAIST, and first of all, I very enjoyed your talk, especially comparing the ventral stream of visual cortex and CNN. And basically, I have two questions. First one is, because I want to believe actually the ventral stream works like CNN, but I really wonder, what do you think about how come the convolution actually happens in visual cortex? Because in my knowledge, the receptive field itself has some retinal, is fixed under some retinotopic location in the visual space, so it cannot convolute over the all spaces, scan for all objects.
Right.
So what do you think about how can brain acts in convolution way? And the second question is, you talk about some topological mapping of orientation and spatial frequency in the 2D map, and I just wonder what's going to be the functional role of that topological mapping of the filters?
Yeah, so the question of convolutions, how do the convolution-like neurons emerge, right? So the idea of sharing weights among neurons in a convolutional net is just a trick to make supervised learning faster. Yeah. If you go to unsupervised learning of the type that I showed, where you use a sparse autoencoder or something like that, you don't need to enforce convolutions. They're just going to appear spontaneously. In other words, you're going to have, and in fact, I showed this in some of the figures where you had repeated filters all around it's one of the papers by, the first author is Carl Greger, where it's a locally connected network with over completeness, so there's multiple neurons looking at the same receptive field, and then receptive field covering the entire space. There is no constraint that it should be equal, but just because the system needs to reconstruct images under uncertainty, under sparsity constraint, it learns replicated filters spontaneously. So I don't think you need to enforce this if you use unsupervised learning. It's only for supervised learning to work. Okay, and the second question was about those sort of topological map, or right. This was just kind of a way of showing that those unsupervised learning algorithms could possibly be an attempt at an explanation for how the type of organization you see in V1 can occur, right? You see those pinwheel patterns and things like this, and that's basically a consequence of overlapping receptive field of sparse complex cells. That's what it comes down to in the end.
What's your idea?
Well, I like this idea. That's one of my papers, so yeah. Okay. But there might be some other mechanism as well that we. I'm not claiming this is what the brain uses. It's just one example of what could happen.
Okay, thank you for answering.
Yeah, just before your talk, you were saying that you're not a big fan of spiking neural networks.
Right.
But I was thinking your last point about you want really big networks, very sparse.
Yep.
If they're all floating point numbers, the hardware is going to have a real tough time. Isn't that an argument for using spiking neural networks where, basically if there's no spike, it doesn't cost anything?
Okay, so this is an issue that I discussed very recently because I gave a keynote just a couple of weeks ago at ISSCC, which is the big conference for the chip industry, right? The solid-state circuit conference. And there are people working on different types of hardware to accelerate convolutional nets, both for learning and for just inference. So the inference, the ConvNet chips that are designed for inference, these are things that you're going to find in your smartphone. Like within a year or two, every smartphone will have a neural net accelerator, a convolutional net accelerator in it. Those things use very low precision arithmetics, fixed point, or even they use exotic arithmetic representation, like logarithmic representation of numbers, which is kind of weird. And it's not, it's basically less than 8-bit precision on the weights, similar for the activations. So you can train a regular net with backprop and then quantize it so that you don't lose any accuracy. and then run it on those networks. In fact, there is something like that going on in the network that Facebook runs on its data centers. They are very, very highly optimized, and the weights are quantized so they can run efficiently on standard CPUs. They don't use 32-bit floating point arithmetics. They use integer. So it's already happening, okay? You can be efficient in that way without going all the way to spiking neurons, okay? And there have been sort of one-to-one comparisons with kind of spiking architectures, and it's not entirely clear that they bring anything to the table. I mean, I'm unconvinced for that reason. Maybe you have some better arguments, we'll see.
Hi, thanks for the talk. So in my mind, a feature of intelligence is that we have this imagination by which we can combine all different categories that we have learned, like an elephant with a lion's head and so on, and even transfer, let's say, verbs that we attach to them. Like, oh, it's an object, I can touch it, then there's a new object, and I do one-shot learning, and I transfer the category. Now, it seems that neural nets, I wonder if, let's say, these world machines that you use basically imagination, your generative model, if that would ever be capable of having this flexible combination of things, or if that's basically with neural nets really hard to achieve. I mean, obviously our brain is composed of neurons, so it must be possible, but I wonder with the model that you set up, if you hope to achieve something like that.
That's a very, very interesting question, and I don't know the answer to it, but there's a debate. There's an interesting debate, particularly in the context of language, natural language processing. The question is whether there is any type of learning, probably supervised, with maybe some combination of self-supervised learning, that will get machines to learn the compositional nature of language, the fact that you can combine words in all kinds of different ways, and it makes sense, and you don't have to have seen an example of this particular combination to imagine that it exists, right? So there are people who've been attempting to do this and showing that the standard, LSTM type recurrent nets don't actually have any type of compositionality. Perhaps the BERT models that I showed may have some. It's not clear. I don't think the experiment has been done completely. And then there are the Chomskyan, the Chomsky, Gary Marcus of the world who say, like, neural nets will never be able to do this unless you hardwire some sort of special symbol manipulation mechanism for it. I don't believe that's the case. I don't believe that you need those special mechanisms, but I do need that eventually you will have to do kind of go to self-supervised learning. You're not going to learn the compositional nature of language purely through supervised tasks. That's pretty clear to me. All right, thank you very much.